first part of this process is, in essence, to create a narrative. Can we define exactly what these things are, why they're important, and what we're trying to achieve? Before we do that, the folks over at Fannie had kind of sent us a orientation perspective view of metadata as they see it. So Norm, why don't you take us through what you've got and position this thing for us?
Okay. So on that first slide, what we found is we had different audiences, and it was useful to kind of group the types of metadata that we had into those categories. And so you're looking at this pyramid where we have, at the conceptual level, we've got our business language. And then that interfaced to our architects at a logical layer. And so you had, and so from a business glossary, you then tried to have ties into your logical data models. From there, we want to connect down into our application models. And then we get down to the physical, where you actually instantiate these systems at a physical layer. And then you had your physical data models, your actual databases, and your BI layers. And so what we found, we actually had different audiences for the metadata that we were collecting. And so we also found that we had technical metadata that morphed into different buckets. We had design time, which is mostly what we're collecting at the moment, where all the information you know about ahead of time. They're coming from models, they're coming from glossaries, and it's basically at the design of the system, as opposed to runtime, which is live and dynamic and changing. We haven't yet really captured that, but we recognize there's a need for it. And then there's operational, what jobs are running where and when, and that type of thing.
So a question, Norm, just a question. What language did you use when you were interacting with the various audiences about this? Did you call it all metadata?
No, actually, we try to stay away from it. I mean,
Good.
we use the term, but it's sort of, I think if you use the wrong jargon, it turns the folks off. So we tried to adopt the language that each of those different user groups was used to. Their business, their business definitions, their business glossary up at the conceptual level, and try to understand how they refer to things. Then when you come down into the models, they actually make a big difference about calling something an entity, attribute, column, or table. So you had to kind of pick up their terminology as well and find out, well, what parts of those models were important to that layer. And what we found is that each audience had different interests in different pieces of the metadata.
Any consistency come out in your initial conversations or from anybody?
The interest in tracing it. Everybody wants to know what is connected to upstream and downstream. And so it kind of supports what we're trying to do by connecting these layers together.
This is good. This is Jim. I can see, for example, one of the reasons why you have the different language, and I'm curious about if you've tried to normalize the language or if you've run into the same difficulty I've seen organizations run into, which is some of these technology implementations limit what you can call something because they have certain standards that they use within their domain to manage their stuff, and you can't always make all the names align because there's only so many characters you can expose on a screen and things like that. Is that something that you? Is that one of the reasons why you divide this up the way you do?
Well, we still have that. That challenge is someone may call something an attribute or a logical name, and somebody else calls it a business term, and by gosh, they don't want to change the name of it from their perspective. Same, to your point, each of these layers created different restraints or constraints that that was one thing. We had to find a metadata system that could actually was flexible enough to be able to be pushed around and take that, because we we can't necessarily force change on any of these layers. You want to facilitate it. So you have to accept them the way they currently are, point out where things would work a lot better if you got into alignment, allow them to mature over time. And that's really the goal here, is to provide visibility. It's like turning a light on in a closet that's been dirty for 20 years. All of a sudden you notice things aren't lining up. And that's one of the things we found by bringing these together. You start to see where it would be nice to connect them in certain ways or to have standards cut across. And so we get involved in the standards at the glossary layer, in the data model layer, to try to make them line up a little better. But it takes time.
In the
it sounds to me like we should start a glossary out of this, because one of the things we should probably keep track of is the language that's being used by various audiences for various components. Mike, do you have a screen up on your, is that you? Okay.
This is Sheila Jeffrey. I had a question on this model. I find it interesting that your business intelligence metadata layer is in your physical environment. I would expect to deliver BI through business terms. Can you explain a little how you got to that placement and what type of vocabulary is related to the metadata in that layer?
Well, and this may show our immaturity. We are just at early stages of integrating the BI layer. We looked at it more from the tie at the physical layer. So one of the things we look for at the intersection of each of these layers is, how do you bridge this gap from one vocabulary to the other? That's where the new value is added. Since each area has their own language, their own tools, their own way of expressing it, we're adding value by making the ties between them, the relationships. And so down at this layer, when we're coming down to this physical stack, at the database layer, we have tables, columns, views, and as you bridge over into that BI layer, it's a physical link. That universe, and I'll use business object speak, but it's similar for any of them, I believe. You want to make that data available for the BI layer, and that's done at a physical layer, usually a one-to-one mapping right to the database, either through views or through joins or in some manner of a SQL connection from that BI tool to the database. And so that's why we have it down at the physical layer. And then as you move over to the reporting layer, you may have other joins and filters and other kinds of queries and things in there. Again, sort of like ETL, but inside the BI layer. And again, at a physical layer.
I appreciate that you're delivering from the physical layer, but my perspective or the concern I'm looking for a home for is that the primary consumers of BI, and even in many cases of reporting, are not going to couch their requirements in physical reference terms. They're going to come and say, I want, in my case from banking, the average monthly balance of my customer portfolio in the Charlotte region. And I realize that's got to get translated and mapped into which are the actual fields and columns from what databases and so forth that are going to be compiled to deliver that. But the request and the interface to me is in business terminology.
Right.
Sheila, I want to speak. This is Jim. From my experience with BI implementations is that some tools may limit you from being able to put actual business terms into the tool, because it creates all sorts of problems with how the tool either functions from the standpoint of navigating and querying the database. And in some instances, I see changes to names because it takes up too much screen real estate, and so you have business terms that become abbreviated or truncated or shortened in some way in order to, be able to get a complex report viewable on a screen. And I'm gonna withhold judgment as to where that stands in terms of an organization's maturity, because it may just be a limitation of the technology. But that was what I was reading into this physical, why they put it in physical. Because I've certainly tried in my own experience and run up against some technology limitations. But I'm curious if anybody else has had the same experience or not.
Well, we've had a similar request to connect it back up to our glossary. We just are not far enough down the road to actually figure out, okay, now that we have this in here, we have traceability down and lineage out to the fields on the report. How do we connect those fields back up to the glossary? We'll probably be looking at that early next year.
You mean physically, or just referencing them in a glossary?
Referencing them through the metadata system.
Yeah, I've done that, but the terminology I've found can be different because of the constraints of the system.
All right, so it sounds to me like the issue that I'm hearing here is the alignment of the business terms with the business intelligence application. How do you reference them, and how do you align them? That sounds like the challenge that you're articulating.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think so, because, I mean, ultimately, whilst I acknowledge that there are tool limitations, I mean, I think that's an interesting facet of our industry, that we talk about delivering business intelligence that then require that people either interface through their application support roles or have to be able to understand the technical definition of the data to be able to use it.
For politeness sake, if you're not speaking, please go on mute because we can hear you typing. Sorry, Sheila, go ahead.
No, that was my main point, is that, I mean, I think an objective over time is that we should allow business people to consume their data using business reference for it, even though we know that ultimately we have to be able to correlate that to physical and technological placement and distribution capability.
I'm violently not in agreement.
I totally acknowledge it's partly a state of the industry, but I think our goal should be to help move to that next level.
Absolutely.
All right, Norm, you want to take us to the next view?
Sure.
Mike's next slide. There you go.
I think we can probably jump over this one. We talked about these layers, but basically we just break it out in a different way. And we've kind of talked to that on that first slide. So let's go to the third slide. Okay, and so here was this the first crack at a maturity model, trying to work it out, and what kind of metrics might be involved. And so we start down at level 0, where we're basically just starting out. Everything's just kind of ad hoc. You kind of know you have to do it, but it's not organized. And so then you start progressing up, where you start getting more processes around it, and you try to organize it typically by the line of business. So you may find a part of the business is actually more organized than another, and that's one of the things that we found here at Fannie is you get a few individuals who can see further down the road. They've inspired the folks that they're working with, and so they get some tools and processes in and devote resources to it, and they move ahead of other parts of the organization. But then you want to try to get that managed and standardized across more of the enterprise. And so as you do more of that and you expect it, you have to tie in governance and try to set these things. You start moving up this maturity curve as it becomes more managed and more standardized.
I have some insight into this, and Jim, you can chime in on this as well because you're struggling with it for the DMM.
Mm-hmm.
But we have kind of an intersection of a bunch of things. So one of the things we have is, I guess what we're going to call capability areas. What are these areas as it relates to the full spectrum of metadata? And we're going to define them, and we're going to try to define them in the ideal. So regardless of where you implement it, whether you implement it at a project or you implement it across your organization, you could probably define the uh, uh, what we mean by ideal capability.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are two types of measurements I think that occur. One is what I'm going to call competency. You know, where are you against that ideal in terms of the activity? And then the second one is maturity, and that means where are you in terms of your organization's adoption. So I kind of look at it as those kind of three-level of view as we're talking about these issues. So Jim, how does that translate into what you're discovering on the ground?
I like the way that sounds. The only thing that may happen over time is that maturity takes on a form that is more than just organizational adoption. It might be other more sophisticated process areas or that are deployed to be at a higher level.
Oh yeah, no, that's valid. I like that too. That's good.
You know, you might use, like, we've got in the DMM right now what we call support process areas, but there might be things that are very special processes that are only level 4 processes that we require you to use in order. But for the most part, I like the idea of maturity really representing the adoption, the cultural change has occurred, which is really what I think is what we mean by maturity. And the competency is definitely, we do find nuances between levels for particular activities that are not forced. You know, you will find higher levels of capability. So that I like it. It sounds like we can really work with that.
Okay.
But the ideal statements are really to get us away from getting locked into these levels and thinking about something from a level perspective before we've even defined what we're talking about. So
yeah, and I think that's the key. So our goal. So let's go to the spreadsheet if we could.
yeah.
So our goal is to ultimately define the ideal in these areas. And in order to define the ideal, the first step in that, I believe, is to just define what these things are and kind of do a brainstorm discussion about the challenges and problems. So that's the proposal that we have in terms of the management of this conversation in its early phases. Does anybody have a concern with that or an alternative point of view? Does that sound reasonable?
Mike, this is Sheila. I just think that we have a concern that there are times when there are interdependencies between capabilities, and if those are not recognized, you can be struggling to get either maturity or, competency in a capability, or move to a level of maturity because you're hindered by the absence of a pre-existing capability that it would be beneficial to have.
So I think we should, so I agree with you, Sheila, that there are some really important dependencies, and we need to make sure that the dependencies and whether they are prerequisites or not need to be understood. So we'll just kind of keep that as a component of our discussion. As we look at it, say this is dependent on that, we'll just make note of it and see if we can craft that as part of the process.
Thank you.
All right, anybody else? Okay, so I think the first part of this was kind of the combination of governance and business value. We were all talking about this as it was one thing. Let's just take a look at the things that we talked about last time, just so we can get ourselves oriented. Feel free to change the verbiage that I'm using. I just kind of did it this morning, so bear with me. So the first one was, how do we demonstrate value of metadata to various constituencies, right? So it's how are we talking about it, and how are people receiving it? And I think, Norm, that's part of the language of the audience that you were articulating earlier. We're going to keep that in the back of our mind. We also then looked at some metrics. How are we going to measure these things? What do we track, and what are we tracking them for? I'm going to scroll down to the metadata governance just so I can get myself oriented. Part of this is about alignment, and I think that's probably very similar to business value. So I guess I would probably make this 15 and 16C as part of the business value conversation. Well, we can talk about that. And then there is the governance process itself. How do we enforce rules, define rules, make people accountable, define the ownership and accountability structures? And then right below that is feedback, training, and those are the things that I captured in terms of kind of the governance and business value. So why don't we just first open up a general conversation? What else needs to be looked at in this area in terms of governance topic areas?
You were talking about specifically with governance or just across all of these?
Well, I think that we were talking about governance, and part of governance was business value in the way that we were describing it in our previous conversation.
Okay.
So it's going to be kind of one issue area. So we can look at them independently if you think it's appropriate.
I would agree that how you position it is going to be based on value, or it should be, and it's even referred to parenthetically. So I would agree with moving it to value.
So generally, do you think that people get the joke about metadata, the value of metadata, or is it something that is not resonating correctly within your institutions?
This is Sheila. I think that people who work in certain roles understand and appreciate the value of metadata, but the majority of the organization views it as an overhead and an impediment to getting progress on projects, because we don't have the existing body of metadata that it would be preferable to have. We're on the left-hand side of the bell curve, where we've got to ramp up and create the majority of the metadata that we need and instantiate the associated processes to keep it current and relevant, without which it becomes useless, or worse, misleading and it's a source of error and therefore gets abandoned. And so I think that the dilemma is how to get to the right-hand side of the bell curve, where you can actually deliver improved business processes because you're leveraging metadata, and I include things like SDLC and application development as business processes because they are processes to a component of the business because of the metadata availability. But until you get to that point, I think it's viewed very often as a barrier to progress and an added expense.
Sheila, how about just conceptually? Do people understand conceptually the importance of metadata definitions, ontologies, terms, consistency, etc.? Do they understand?
When you say people, do you mean the majority of the corporation in general, or specific populations, Mike?
Well, that's a good question. I look at it kind of overall organizationally. When I say people, I mean organization.
I would say no. I mean, I think if you went out and asked one of our brokers or a CSR in a branch, do you think it's helpful if you've got good business definitions? At one level, they might say yes, but they don't think about it as an enabler for their job.
Right. Yeah, and
Well,
I would
so
say
doesn't that define one of the things that we have to address? Because unless I am wrong in my assessment, having comparability, consistency, and precision of data is the prerequisite for many things. Integration, automation, um, composite
yep.
views. I mean, all of that stuff is dependent upon consistency of the underlying data.
Well, I think all of us, and that was why I asked the audience question, Mike, is because I think all of those of us who work in this field deeply appreciate and probably have decades-long frustrations over this issue. But the problem is when you're someone who's trying to get a check reordered, handled for an irate customer in a branch, you don't really care about the ability to integrate your data for analytic purposes. You just want to know why you can't get the check numbers in range in correctly to get to Harlan to order the new checkbooks or whatever.
All right, so I think you're articulating one critical thing, right, which is the link between problems and data precision. Right? If
Yep.
we can't make that link, then people
Right.
aren't going to understand this activity.
Right. And so I think they probably recognize the value of it if they're new to the system and they're trying to find the information that they need, and they're assuming that it's one thing when it might be another, and then they painfully learn that they were wrong in their assumption. That's the point at which, if they were presented with a solution, they would say, yeah, that's exactly what I need. But I would agree with Sheila that in most cases they wouldn't know that they needed good metadata in order to have prevented that problem.
I would actually say that if we had a good metadata, what's the word I want, sort of infrastructure and ecosystem, that most people would find their jobs easier and more enjoyable, but they wouldn't know why.
Right.
And the kind of analogy
Don't we have an obligation then to explain that, or we're going to be stuck with this secret that we need to address?
Right.
Well, where I was going to go with that, though, Mike, is I think it's something that needs to get fixed, but I don't know if everybody needs to know why that is, because, I drive on the road and I don't get sideswiped by vehicles, or if there is a very wide vehicle coming, it has a flag vehicle before and behind it, because there are actually rules that say how wide vehicles can be for United States roadway systems. Most of us don't know that, and we don't think about that. When we go to buy a car, we don't look at it and go, ooh, does it meet the federal requirements for width? We just take all of that for granted. And my point about metadata is it should be like those kinds of rules. It just is being done right so things work correctly for people.
I know, but it is.
I think the effort of education it could be a lot of expense and distraction. Now, getting our executives perhaps to understand it is a different issue in the right areas.
All right, so I'm going to pull out of that, Sheila. Who matters in terms of the relationship between metadata and business problems, and at what level do they need to be educated? Because doesn't that define our challenge? Because right now, we might assume that it's not important for people to know why metadata matters, but it is, because metadata is not correctly positioned within most organizations.
I think that's a good way to look at it, and there are going to be different points. Like, for example, those who are responsible for training, training your sales staff. They're the ones who are establishing kind of the standard language that's communicated about whatever they're being trained on, whether it's to be a broker or whatever. And there are certainly terms and definitions and all sorts of contexts that are created in order to establish that understanding with that salesperson. And then that person then assumes that those terms of art and those meanings associated within them are all consistently applied throughout their organization in order to help them to continue to sell. but it's not the case. So, very rarely you would see training, for example, working hand in hand with BI projects on establishing reporting requirements for how much sales we're doing and what's our projections and who are we talking to. And so it's connecting those people in the common language that they need to have in order for them to get to that higher level of maturity.
All right, so training is an interface to real people.
Yeah.
What else? So Sheila, you were mentioning, I guess, the quote-unquote senior executives. Can you define that a little bit better for me?
I think that if we can help executives that are responsible for business functions understand when data problems disrupt their organization or create exception conditions, that is a huge driver for asking for improved data quality, which drive metadata management and maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about the heads of various business functions.
Right.
Go a little lower than that.
So, I mean, my pushback in the earlier conversation, Mike, was I don't want to try and educate 200,000 operational folks at Bank of America as to why metadata is important, if it's a CSR or a teller. Or what I do think is that the executives who have responsibility for designing branch functions should understand how important pristine quality data is to the smooth running of their organizations and the processes they're delivering to their customers. If they get that, when they ask for that good quality data, it will lead to improved things like don't take data into a system until the valid values are matching what you need. In other words, don't take it in and fix it later after it's caused either exception processing, correction handling, or a data error and a customer problem. Get it right on entry. And I mean, I don't like to say this, but I know there are operational processes within my organization where we don't necessarily insist on correct data on entry and then try and fix it later.
So I think that what you're pointing out, however, is that rules without cognition of why it's so critical just becomes a massive to-do list that winds up being overwhelming or meaningless.
Right, and then tends to get resistance and avoidance.
Another scenario I think that gets business leaders engaged in metadata is in large organizations where you have the business at large or other areas of the business reporting on their business function in the context of other business functions and analyzing it, and there's a real stake they have that the data is correct because they're being scrutinized and being compared, and maybe even their budget is associated with it. So there's a real stake in making sure that that how that business is being talked about and measured and analyzed is consistent with how they actually run their business, which gets back to
so then the question goes back to, how are we describing this to those business leads? What mechanisms do we use? How do we do that?
Business reporting is one place you can do it.
What do you mean by that, Jim?
Well, if you've got a BI project, you want your BI solution to be driven by the reporting requirements of the business, and the reporting requirements of the business need to come down from the business objectives. And so you can't really have a real discussion about business objectives and reporting requirements without talking to the business leads, because ultimately they're the ones who are held accountable to how their business is being measured and analyzed and reported to see.
So you just made, if I counted correctly, a four-step activity, right? If we're trying to look at, you were using business intelligence value, the value of a tool, backwards to the importance of having the language correct to be able to do that, because without the language, you can't define the requirements for reporting, and without
Right.
doing that, you can't understand the fundamental business objectives, right? So business objectives, reporting requirements, BI value, and finally language.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and the language becomes critical because many times you're also coming up with metrics, business metrics that they define.
I'm going to suggest that there's a gap, however, between the problem of the business intelligence tools functionality and value and the connection back to something as boring as standard data definitions.
Right. Yes.
And we just need to do a better job of doing that. And I'm going to suggest that we don't do a very good job at all of doing that. And that's my question out to you guys.
When you say we don't do a good job of doing that, Mike, I'm
making the connection between the business objective or the business problem and metadata precision, data definitions. Right. So I think that if I'm hearing this correctly, Sheila, the real key, or one of the keys, is to ensure that there is a cognition between the problem that people are facing in the real world and the data objective that we're all talking about.
Yes, because on the one hand you could have traceability, which is improvement, where you can link the pigeon language in the BI tool back to a business concept that people can readily understand. But that's predicated on a number of things, one of which is that somebody even knows that there is a glossary they can look something up in, because most of them probably don't use it. And the other is the age-old problem of the same terms being used in different business contexts, and once you put that into an enterprise solution, you end up with lengthy names that are providing context to common terms just to represent them uniquely in the system, and then it becomes too unwieldy to put on a report or a screen, or it's a problem of common language.
I think that's a part of it. I think the other, well, it's really the business case for data management, but since data management requires metadata, I think it's at a secondary remove, the business case for metadata, which is that we encounter a large number of business problems that are actually caused by data problems, but they get treated as being something else, like procedural problems or personnel issues. So I'm thinking of something like a social security number gets transposed and then creates problems down the road because the identity of the person is, we later on when they call in, they can't get authenticated because the social security number for them is incorrect in the system or something like that. That to me is a reflection that we're not implementing metadata and the related data quality rules sufficiently well.
Okay, so let's pick on that for a second, Sheila, because I think what you said was really critical, and not very happy, which is the business case for data management includes the business case for metadata, and people don't believe it. So they look at something else being the problem, and I have a firsthand experience with that as well. I remember being called before the executive management board at SIFMA talking about data issues, and we were talking about data definitions and the critical importance of getting them right, and they basically threw me out of the room. They go, yeah, that's not it. Of course it is it, but they didn't believe it, and they didn't want to believe it.
Well, it's a vocabulary thing again, isn't it? You've got to find out what their concerns are and frame it around those areas. Let me give a quick example, because I was struggling with this here, drawing a diagram.
Yeah.
I try to come up with use cases, and what I have at the moment, is just the first crack, is 4 different areas. You've got regulatory mandates, where you have to demonstrate certain capabilities to government organizations. So you need metadata to do that, but I don't talk about it as metadata. It's a business need that has to take place, and I use metadata to get it done. I also, from a design standpoint, will have impact assessment. So I'm going to add a report, change a field on a report, or change something in the database. So I have a design standpoint where there's a use case for metadata. I also have operational issues where something went wrong on this report, and so I'll have a root cause analysis. Again, we use metadata to try to get the lineage, to go back upstream to see where things happen. But we use the terminology, for each of these areas. We don't just call it metadata. We talk about, well, here's regulatory compliance. We're going to do A, B, and C. Control the vocabulary, show you traceability, whatever. Then, operational issues, it's different. Now, listening to Sheila, I'm not exposed as much on the business side, but what I distilled out of it is there's this other bucket of just comprehension. When a lot of things fall in it. What's the definition? What's it composed of? What's the traceability?
So Norm, I think that you're defining the first step, which is, can we talk about the relationship links between business problems and data without using the word metadata? So what is it, right? First one you said was comparability, or I think I heard was
regulatory mandates.
Well, even regulatory mandate is not a data challenge until you make the connection between the regulatory objectives and data, and we've got to focus, I think, at that level, right? So I look at comparability of data across repositories. I look at precision of terminology as it relates to the legal obligations of various functions. And I'm struggling with making sure that we can define the reasons why data matters, why data language matters. And let me challenge you to put more on the bones of either comparability or precision of obligation that I'm missing. Because how do you define this?
I'm not sure I understand. How do I define what comparability?
So when you try to talk about data value, the question is, why is it important? Well, one reason it's important is in order to compare data that comes from multiple repositories, from multiple vendors, so that we're all selecting the right concept, is one thing. Second, the precision of the language matters because we have some legal obligations that we have to do, and we better know the difference between derived maturity and, I'm just making up stuff, but, the precision of the language. Is there anything else?
So Mike, to me, this goes back to a way I've viewed the problem space for a long time, which is, are you optimizing within an organizational unit? What level are you optimizing at? Because very often what is optimal for the enterprise has a degree of suboptimal impact at, say, a line of business level. And I know that the challenge that I have deduced we face is that the majority of funding, at least in an organization like a bank, is done on an organizational unit level, say at the line of business. And so within a line of business, they may standardize their language, but it won't match another line of business. And because they've optimized what is convenient to them and what they will fund, but they don't care that wealth management and consumer bank don't have the same vocabulary, because they're not the people that get impacted by trying to bring the data from those two organizations together. It's some downstream group like householding or are analysts who want to look at number of services per customer who have that challenge. And they're not a cost center, and they don't have the same degree of funding. And,
okay, but Sheila, I'm going to take all that and say the process linkage is not, a connection is not made, right? That one group's myopic view does not translate into the organization's collective view.
Correct. So they've optimized at the subunit level, not at the organizational level.
But what's even, I would add to that, I would agree with that. And then, you know, most of these areas are not operating in a vacuum. They have to be able to interact with outside parties. You know, so traders talk to traders, and operations talks to the DTC or to other operations or what have you. They do connect with outside parties, and those pigeon languages across those functional areas might reflect discontinuities of language between different categories of the entire industry. So it is a difficult problem.
All right, so let's just make sure we got this correct. If I'm hearing correctly, the process linkages are not understood. The importance of data comparability not fully appreciated. Mm-hmm. The precision of obligation and its relationship to language is not clear. Are the three things I've heard so far. And what else? Anybody else have anything?
But I think that part of that discussion, Mike, is that we have not yet shown that optimizing the processes at the enterprise level has more economic benefit by having some cost impact on organizational units than optimizing our businesses at the unit level and taking a hit at the enterprise.
Well, no, I think, and right. So it's the reason, the way that you make these connections has to be linked to either cost containment, you know, more efficient operations, process, you know, smooth processes. So we got to link this. We got to link this to business value. But frankly, we're not only are we not able to link it to business value, we're not describing it to them in a way that allows them to make that connection. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of our fundamental challenges in data management.
Well, I think the challenge is when you try to do that, you either end up with an expectation that you're going to convert the terminology and language of components within your organization, which isn't very viable for lots of reasons, cultural, financial, etc. Or you end up with needing to take the overhead of a relatively complex kind of mapping and integration capability, which has got to still be less expensive than the perceived benefit of getting to the endpoint. And I'm not sure I've seen those arguments made yet.
Yeah, so I think you're saying is we've got to be clear about why it is worth the effort. Mm-hmm. And if we can't do that, then you know, people are not going to do it because it's hard
and expensive.
And expensive. And you can look at all the obstacles that we've said previously. So in addition to the cognition problem, do they even know that there is a standard glossary that's in existence and how to get access to it? And is it part of the way the organization, kind of the rules of the organization in terms of the way it operates?
And to Sheila's earlier point about if you do it right, it's one of those things that you may not even notice. You just take it for granted. Is if you have to do less translating of what you're seeing in a particular context and having to translate into something that you know because it's not represented the way that you would say it yourself. How many times do you do that throughout a day just to get through your job? If there's more precision and more of a common language, then you wouldn't even notice that you no longer have to do all this translating anymore.
Right.
Right. So pulling people out of their reconciliation nightmare would be one way of demonstrating value.
Yes. Yeah, because the translation is reconciliation against what you. Yeah, I agree.
Well, it's reconciliation and transformation processes that kind of become the bad data tax that we all pay,
right,
but that no one tracks.
Right. Well, it's so embedded in how it's what's more natural than talking, right? You just
Missed
don't realize
that last part, but I'll assume that went somewhere, Jim.
Well, what's more natural than the language that we speak? And if you're constantly having to translate the tools that you use into the things that you understand and how you talk, you don't even pay attention to how many times you have to do that.
Well, I think it gets back to Sheila's core word of optimized in my little domain, right? People are doing things in their own silo or activity area.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's easier to do it that way in the short run.
Well, yeah, and even, you might have even fully optimized it, which means that if you want to now fit into the bigger picture, you're going to have to give a little bit.
Well, no one wants to do that. I think this is an area that we need to spend a lot more time on, which is the link between the data management activities and business value in a real sense, right? And we have not done that very well.
Mm-hmm.
And we're doing it even worse with something as scary as metadata. We don't. I would advocate never using that word in polite company, but we do. And the link, the gap between the data language and the business value, the tools we use, and the processes we go through seem to be fairly large.
So it seems to me that and I don't know how to do this. If I did, I would either be a very rich consultant or probably significantly more advanced in my career or something. But the dilemma for me is how do you get to where you're reporting against actual business incidences and expenses and tying them back to the fact that, oh, well, the reason that promotion didn't work was that the report you used that said you had 18% of your customers who were interested in this kind of product had actually picked up incorrect data fields to make that assumption and feed you that. So the $50,000 you spent on your marketing campaign didn't get you the 5% return, it got you a 0.03% return because there was bad data in the report you based it off.
And
That's
Sheila, if we can't do that,
show them.
If we can't do that, we won't advance the practice of data management as fast as we all hope.
I absolutely agree, but most organizations are not equipped to allow us to be able to make that kind of business observation where they realized that not only was the time and money put into developing the report not well spent, but then the program they based on it was lost value.
Well, what do you mean by equipped? Jim, hang on 1 second. Are we not capable, or we don't, or we're not allowed? What do you mean not equipped? We don't know how to do it?
I think a lot of the times people might never even realize that that could have been a reason why the campaign failed.
Right. I absolutely agree with you on that.
They just go, oh, well, that was a bust. Well, and they don't actually go back and say, well, why were we so far off?
Yeah, well, why do I have to repair this trade? Why do I have to transform my data?
There's too much emphasis placed on one's gut and judgment, and that information is just kind of like just to get the wheels turning, and that's at least what I've found is that there's not. Part of the problem here is not seeing the criticality of how the information does shape the way that you make decisions, and that when it's incorrect, that there is a cost.
Right.
But you don't make that linkage if you just treat reports as just kind of like, well, it helped, but really it was.
No, we've got to lead them down this path, Jim. We've got to make this linkage.
Yeah, yes.
If we're going to talk about data, we those are in data are not talking about it correctly. And yes, I realize that the pathway to do it is hard, but we're not even at the first step. Go ahead, Sheila. I'm sorry.
But we've also got to get past. Even if you did get that realization, and let's say then that there had been this justification for a marketing campaign that was expected to give a $250,000 revenue lift to a region. And it turns out that the report it was based on and the money spent promoting it didn't yield that outcome, and they only got a $50,000 lift. And so the statistics now for the business person responsible for this is showing that instead of spending $100,000 and getting a $250,000 return, they spent $100,000 and got a $10,000 lift. They're not going to necessarily eagerly lay out why that happened, quite frankly.
Right.
And if you're the programmer down at the bottom of the stack who goes, well, they told me they wanted these fields and I gave it to them, but the programmer did what they were told, the business analyst didn't really understand what it means, and the business executive that was running the program just presumed everybody else had got it right. They don't want to hear this message, quite frankly.
No, agreed. Nobody ever promised you a rose garden, Sheila. That's why you're stuck.
No, So firstly, even doing the analysis and arriving at that conclusion is not normally undertaken. And even if you did get the fact that that was why, and I mean, this is just a made-up example, and I hope that the majority of the time it's incorrect as an example, but we do use the right data. But I mean, we know these kinds of things can happen. There wouldn't be a large willingness to lay that out and take it to the executive of that organization and say, we need better quality data because look at this snafu we just had.
Well, why not? Isn't that the goal? Isn't our goal to be able to demonstrate the value equation?
Because it would be deemed as admitting to having failed in that instance and not done their job correctly and lay them open to negative consequence in this year's performance review, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, well, no, I understand that. I understand that.
We could say it would be political.
Well, I mean, no, I understand that, and I understand it's a real issue. But if we can't do it correctly at the right level, then we're going to be kind of stuck in this, place that we're in.
Right.
And I'm not going to be stuck.
I agree.
And I don't want us to remain stuck. So, for instance, something I do see as potentially an avenue that we could use to try and make business value argument is my understanding is that in Basel reporting, there is now a category of concern against, this is in the banking industry, against Basel reports, that the data either was unavailable and therefore we get actually deemed to be in the worst possible situation since we're not providing reliable data. So that's kind of like if you can't provide a credit score, we assume it's 500, and we'll charge you the relevant interest rate. In the banking world, the assumption is on the worst case scenario, and it means our capital expectations are based off that worst case if we can't provide good, reliable data. Or there is actually a category, I believe now, where we report that there are data errors, and they are assessed as having an impact on our Basel reporting and therefore on our capitalization. That, to me, is an avenue where we could actually start to say there is a real cost associated with this situation.
So I think, and I realize that we're now over time, so I need to pull this to a close. But what I'm going to suggest we tee up is the mechanism for the traceability that you just concluded with needs to be defined. You know, how do we track the relationship between data and business objective in a real sense? And we need multiple examples, right? So the Basel compliance is one example. I remember, and Jim, you were on the phone with our friend Waleed, who explained, you know, the problem of not having correct customs procedure data, you know, stopped the trucks at the border and, you know, caused all kind of quote unquote reconciliation that either was a big delay for their, you know, their supply chain delivery process, even spoilage of the food that was sitting in the truck, and that's just a data problem, right? Get your data right.
Yep.
Okay, so we only allocated an hour. We decided to do this, I think, every 2 weeks for a while. Before we conclude, is that still a reasonable assumption, or do you want to do these more frequently? I'm going to suggest that next week is not good. So the next meeting, I think, is scheduled for the week of the 10th, actually on the 11th at the same time. So Jim, Mike, and I, we will assemble our notes, get it back out to the community, and reconvene on December 11th. With that, I will call the meeting to an end, and thank you all very much for your engagement. So long.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Mike. Everyone.